Okay, thanks Dave for allowing me to observe your lesson yesterday. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the focus of your lesson, which was making progress, making sure that pupils are making clear progress against your objectives.
Yeah.
And that relates to Teacher Standard 2. We're then going to explore and unpick some of the progress of some of the key groups or key pupils in that lesson. And then I'm going to use the coaching questions on the form to kind of unpick that progress even more, and then we'll end up hopefully with some targets at the end of the lesson.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, so your progress, or the focus, was to make sure that pupils were making clear progress against the objectives. So what were the objectives you set for that lesson?
So it was a focus on timing. So they've been working on a chord sequence and looking at songs that fit that chord sequence. So the main focus, or the main objective, was to improve their sense of timing and rhythm.
Okay. So if you were looking for them to improve their sense of timing and rhythm, physically, what would you want to see or hear at the end of that lesson to know that they had achieved that objective?
So with this chord sequence, they're pretty much all of them are at a stage now where they can do that fairly fluently. So what I'd expect to see at the end of that lesson is the pair's able to sing some of the songs over the top of the chords, keeping them in time with the chords as they were going.
Okay, brilliant. And did you see that from all of your pupils by the end of the lesson, or hear that?
I heard it from a selection of people that I'd listened to. I couldn't say that I'd listened to every single pair.
All right. So in terms of formatively assessing that progress, what methods did you use against those objectives?
So I had conversations with some pairs about song choices that they could or couldn't use. So some of them were able to say to me, for example, that one song wouldn't necessarily go straight after another because the way it was recorded was in a completely different tempo, so a lot slower perhaps than the other two songs they'd gone with. And then pairs that I listened to at the end of the lesson, some of them in pairs, I would go out, take their headphones out, listen to what they were able to do and their song over the top of the chords. And then at the end we had the whole class listening to one pair who did their performance at the front of the class in front of the others.
Okay, so therefore modelling what you would have expected at the end of that lesson.
Yes.
Yeah. So let's pick up on all of the positives of the lesson. So think about the children that made that real depth in their progress. So who were they? You don't necessarily have to say names. And then more importantly, why was it that they made that progress in terms of your planning and your teaching and therefore their learning?
The two girls, I'll use the two girls that performed at the end. Neither of them are particularly musical in the whole sense of the word, but they were so focused on the task. I think that part of it was they were looking at songs that they recognised and knew, so they could almost see where their objective was going to be met. If they could sing them along with the chords and it sounded good, then they would know themselves that they kind of made the progress.
Okay, so they were engaged in the lesson.
Yeah.
So that was a real plus of the lesson in terms of their progress. Now let's think about some of the children who didn't necessarily make the progress, but again, importantly, let's explore the reasons why that was. So if you could just give me, not necessarily names, but just think of a few pupils.
There are a couple of boys that when I went to see them, they could play the chords, but they were kind of struggling with keeping those in time with words, and also semi-reluctant to sing. They said they'd have been happy to sing in front of their friends or just me, but they didn't want to sing in front of a whole class.
Interestingly, I picked up on some reluctant singers. So, so if you could plan that time again, or that part of the lesson again, what might you do to make sure that progress was there for them, and we can't get rid of that sort of fear of singing overnight, but we can certainly think about it long term.
Yeah.
So if you could replan that part of the lesson, or what might you've done differently to make sure those children those boys in particular, were more focused?
There have been lessons in the past where I've done a similar task where we sang as a whole class at the start. If it sounded like a reluctant class or a quiet class, we would sing particular songs with a Cockney accent, or we would sing, we would purposely sing out of tune, just as loud as we could and out of tune, to kind of get over the fact that people could hear you. So I would possibly have put a little bit of that into the modelling at the end, or perhaps before we'd kind of gone through the more serious version, so that they could...
Okay, that would work. One of the thoughts I had is when you have them sat round in a big sort of semicircle, do all of those children need to be there? What about those who are making progress already? So presumably you have brought them there because what you have done is you have gauged that there is a misconception, or they're at that stage that's ready to move on. Do all of those pupils need to be there, or could some continue? Or what would be the benefit of drawing them out in small groups, for example?
Are you talking about the hypothetical lesson, like if I were to get them in to do...
Yeah, so if you did it again.
Yeah. I think that there would be a case to argue that some people could kind of carry on in their pairs. One of the things I wanted them to, one of the things I modelled to them and was hoping that the more advanced pairs would be able to do was kind of overlap their songs. I wouldn't be happy kind of just saying to them, you can overlap songs, you don't need to have that modelled to you. So I think there are certain things that the whole class would have needed. Yeah. I think if I were to do it again and there were some reluctant singers, yes, I could take them as like a subgroup, and I could...
So they've got less of an audience,
The only downside I could see with that in a room like this is that if people are trying to get on with their own singing, and there's a group of 10 people that are singing particularly loudly and out of tune in an attempt to try and get people to become a bit more perhaps vocal, it might be off-putting to the pairs that were...
Okay. Could you take them out of the room?
I guess, or I could send some of the more developed groups out to practice rooms.
Brilliant. Okay. Any pupils that just didn't make very much any progress at all?
Not that I saw.
Okay, brilliant. So I'm going to take you through some of the coaching questions. Before I do that, actually, let's think about all of those great things that I wrote down. So pupils are on task from the beginning of the lesson. Despite all the practicalities of setting up, a practical lesson, there was no time wasted. They were all engaged as they were coming through the room. I had your photos in front of me, so I could see who I needed to maybe go and spend a little bit more time with talking to you, so thank you for that. Your routines are clear, they knew exactly what they were doing, they knew that when you played the chord, I don't know what it's called.
The countdown thing.
Thank you, they came to the room, so your expectations, they're really embedded. You recapped at the beginning of the lesson just to check sort of that key vocab, and they knew where they were heading, and they all did. Your lesson objectives your learning objectives were clear and challenging, and you were using those Bloom's words like understand, create, develop. So they were deep. There was nothing superficial about those. Picked up on uniform. You have a lovely relaxed sense of humour and a relaxed tone with them. They're engaged on the whole. Reluctant singers, you encourage them in a reassuring manner, which was really, really nice. So you want them to participate. You have that expectation, but that's something that needs to be worked on. And that would have been me at school as well. I would have hated that. So you regrouped them based on your formative assessment, and we've explored the way that we might do that in small groups. And your intervention is targeted. What I saw, actually, you did pull a couple of girls out. And that was a very, very powerful part of the lesson. Why was that what did they then go back and do? So think about why there was real impact on progress there. So why might that have been? Think about building on that.
Their question, I think, going back to that lesson, was very specific. It was about how a particular tune could, where the melody went with one of the songs, I think it was.
Yeah.
So it was very specific to them. So it wasn't as if it was something that any groups could do. Their group had decided they were going to do that. So I think perhaps that was...
They knew exactly what they needed to do to improve within about 30 seconds of you having that conversation with them. So thinking about picking up on the real strength of that lesson and building something like that into lessons in terms of you are formatively assessing how each group is doing, pulling them out, quick conversation. You can't do that every lesson, but you could do that with some of those key pupils. We've talked about reluctant singers. It's difficult. How do you tackle those that don't ever want to participate?
I've started to take a bit of not a tougher line, but just a kind of, I don't know, the ones that say, there are so many kids that will say, I'm not singing for an assessment, that's not going to happen. And I've kind of found with a lot of groups that you just kind of say, well, you are. Like
Yeah.
they need to get your assessment done. There are some groups where you can you make your own judgment call of whether they're saying it just because they don't want to sing or whether they're genuinely petrified. Those times I would sometimes say, right, well, I will assess your group away from the rest of the class. But I'd say that's kind of just judged on an individual basis.
I think it's that over time you're not going to cure that shyness, but as long as they start to feel comfortable with you, and you can say to them, within 4 or 5 weeks, we need to be making sure that you feel comfortable enough. So let's work together. It's about having that dialogue with them, isn't it? So that might be something we can think about. Okay, so let me just pick a few of these key questions. You picked up on all the key vocab. Do all of them know what a chord is? You explained tempo. You made sure they knew what that was. Was chord introduced from a previous lesson?
Chord, they've looked at chord since year 7.
Okay, so they should know what that was. Brilliant. Okay, we can leave that then. That was just me. So, one of the key questions I've written here is, it's a largely practical environment. How can you ensure that pupils are actually making that progress against your objectives rather than what I've written here is just mucking about on the keyboards? So think about that. How do you know? Who are you going to target first, and how do you know that?
I think in a lesson where they've all got headphones on, I probably need to move around the room perhaps more than I would do if I was teaching a lesson where people are sat just at desks facing the front. I'm aware of that, and I do feel like I'm kind of constantly on the move. I don't think, apart from obviously when I'm speaking to a pair and individuals, I've also kind of tuned my ear into, like if someone has got a rhythm going and they shouldn't be listening to a rhythm, I can just pick it up even with their headphones on. I do kind of feel like in a practical room like this, you need to use your eyes quite a lot, and you need to kind of be constantly moving.
Yeah. Brilliant. Okay. How did you differentiate for that lesson? So if you wanted all of those children to, I can't remember what the objective was now, but you wanted all of them to achieve that objective. How were you differentiating? Were you differentiating by resource or? So
it was the time. It was the sense of timing was kind of the main objective I was looking at. So with the sheets that they had, I mean the sheets weren't kind of differentiated. It was just a list of songs. Yeah. And I guess the way they would choose them would be their favourite songs of the ones on the list. The way I wanted to kind of push people further was the layering the songs over the top of each other. Yeah. Because just getting your timing is quite difficult.
And that sounded lovely when you did it.
I was pleased with that modelling. Yeah, at the start where we did it as the whole class. Yeah. That was kind of if you want to push yourself further, this is what you can do, because just getting one song over the top of the chords is difficult enough. I think it's achievable for everyone in the class, but to put 2 over the top, that is kind of pushing a little bit further. And a lesson that we've looked at previously, actually, where we were looking at the 4-chord sequence, they're aware that there are different ways they can play the chords. If you just play the chord in its kind of simple block, it's going to work, it will sound fine. But if you want to kind of add a slightly more complex rhythm, you can do that as well, and it will sound better. Yeah. Because it's more difficult.
Okay. So just going to pick up on those. You would have had a few low ability readers in that class. I found it difficult to see the board from the back.
Okay.
Mainly because it was just very, very small font, and that could be my eyesight. But that could be the case for pupils in there. So how might you, if you were replanning or re-resourcing, what might help so that the children are not struggling to see the board and therefore engage with the task?
I could have had my modelled version on a card for them.
Yeah, that might be the best. Yeah, or something that is slightly less wordy for those children who just look at that writing and freak out about that. Okay, I think that's it in terms of exploring. We spoke about this during the lesson, but if you had a very, very able musician who did a lot of music outside of school, how would you have challenged that child during that lesson? That you didn't, but how would you if you?
So there's kind of 2 things that I would use with someone that's perhaps a pianist outside the lesson as well. So most of them play with just a right hand, so they could add their left hand to it as well with a bass line. It'd be quite complex. I've had other lessons where I've kind of used those people to support others in the class as well, and almost have them as like an expert that they can go to if anyone else is struggling as
that
well.
would be a classic, but actually there could be a contra argument to that. But so they're helping out and they're consolidating their learning, but where's that depth of challenge? So again, that might be something to think about. Not necessarily for this class, but moving forward. Okay, so if you were setting yourself 1 or 2 targets in terms of improving progress in that lesson, I would say all of the children at face value made expected progress in that lesson, which was great to see. What would you do in terms of refining your teaching at this stage? If you were setting yourself a target, we won't have time to kind of set a smart target now, but we can certainly have some ideas to work with. So what would you say would be your one thing that you're going to refine?
I think I'd probably make more use of the pupils. I think I modelled quite a lot from the front myself. I think on reflection it was perhaps because it might seem a bit harsh to be like, right, I want you two at the front to do this. But perhaps if I was doing that lesson again, or if I was trying to make progress with that class again, I'd maybe have a conversation with a couple and say, right, next time I want you to be at the front. You're going to have a song put together, 3 together. I want you to kind of take through it, so make more use of the
Brilliant.
pupils.
So we could try that and reflect on that. Anything else in terms of assessment or differentiation, maybe? So we're looking at teacher standard 5 and 6 here.
Okay. I quite like the idea of having the individual sheets that you said. Perhaps that would make it easier and more accessible for people that perhaps struggle to see the board and the small
because
writing.
I mean there was a lot of lyrics. There were a lot of lyrics on that sheet. It's, you could have had low ability readers in there, for example. You may wanted just more simple lyrics, but the outcomes were the same. For example, thinking about scaffolding. Okay, so we've got potentially thinking about adapting some resources, teacher standard 5, and we have talked about we'll need to set a target on terms of maybe different ways of formative assessment so that we can think about working with some small groups.